What happens when criticism stops being just an opinion? When does commentary, spoken casually, confidently, even philosophically, cross a line where it no longer lives in the realm of ideas, but instead triggers real-world consequences? And in an industry where reputation is currency, which is more powerful in the end? Words spoken publicly, or leverage applied privately? Hip-hop has always thrived on confrontation. From battle raps to diss tracks, from lyrical dominance to public rivalries, conflict has never been an outsider to the culture. It's been one of its engines. Artists challenge each other openly. They test credibility. They expose contradictions. They speak loudly and expect a response just as loud. But every once in a while, a conflict unfolds that doesn't follow the usual script. There's no diss track. No freestyle rebuttal. No interview shouting match. Instead, the response comes quietly, through contracts, security cameras, and legal notices. Through doors that don't open anymore. Through lights that no longer turn on. This is one of those stories. What began as a podcast conversation about ethics, about documentaries, consent, and exploitation, spiraled into something far more calculated. An eviction. A public humiliation. And a reminder that in modern hip-hop, some battles aren't fought on a stage at all. At the center of it, Jim Jones, 50 Cent, and a sequence of decisions that turned commentary into consequence. So before we go any further, ask yourself this. When you challenge someone publicly, are you prepared for how they might respond privately? Part 1. The conversation that started it. In December 2025, Jim Jones appeared on the podcast Let's Rap About It, a platform known for its candid discussions, insider perspectives, and unapologetic commentary on hip-hop culture. The episode wasn't marketed as controversial. There were no warning signs. No dramatic teasers. The topic sounded almost academic. Documentaries. More specifically, one question framed the discussion. Is it ethical to produce a documentary about someone without their approval? On the surface, it was a fair question. Even a necessary one in an era where content is constant, narratives are monetized instantly, and public figures often lose control of their own stories. The panel didn't hedge. They expressed discomfort. Strong discomfort. Words like petty, exploitative, and facilitated embarrassment surfaced early. One host compared unauthorized documentaries to releasing private recordings without consent, arguing that both weaponize exposure rather than inform the public. Another voice raised legal concerns. Defamation. Misuse of likeness. The murky gray area where storytelling ends and character damage begins. This wasn't a neutral conversation. It wasn't theoretical. The tone sharpened as the discussion went on, becoming more pointed, more deliberate. And while no one said a specific name, the timing made the implication almost impossible to ignore. Only weeks earlier, 50 Cent had released Sean Combs, The Reckoning, a high-profile Netflix documentary dissecting serious allegations surrounding Sean Combs. The project dominated headlines and sparked intense debate across the industry. The podcast's critique mirrored those debates almost too perfectly. Coincidence? Or coordination? Jim Jones eventually summarized the sentiment with a line that would echo far beyond the studio walls. A documentary should honor someone, not tear them down. It sounded philosophical, even principled. But was it just a general belief? Or was it a veiled criticism aimed squarely at 50 Cent? That ambiguity mattered very little, because 50 didn't hear it as abstract commentary. He heard it as a challenge. And history has shown us something important about 50 Cent. When he takes something personally, it rarely ends with a response. It ends with a result. Part 2. Why this hit different. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand the people involved. Not just as artists, but as operators. Jim Jones has always positioned himself as a voice of authenticity. A survivor of industry cycles. Someone who's seen trends rise and collapse, and who speaks with the authority of experience. 50 Cent, on the other hand, has spent the last decade redefining power in hip-hop. Not through music alone, but through ownership. Television. Film. Real estate. Infrastructure. Where many artists respond emotionally, 50 responds structurally. So when he heard the critique, he didn't jump on Instagram Live to argue ethics. He didn't write a thread explaining his intent. He didn't defend his documentary. Instead, he asked a different question entirely. Who's really in position here? And that's where the story took its turn. Part 3. From words to receipts. Rather than engage publicly, 50 Cent went quietly to the source of Jim Jones's operation. Not the podcast hosts. Not the producers. Not the microphones. The building. Behind the scenes, Jim Jones and his podcast team were operating out of a studio space governed by a complicated, and according to the landlord, unfinished, agreement. This wasn't a clean lease. It was a patchwork of expectations, promises, and unresolved obligations. Rent disputes had been ongoing. Utility payments were allegedly inconsistent. Ownership terms remained unclear. The landlord, identified publicly only as Sam, later described an arrangement that had been strained long before the podcast episode ever aired. According to Sam, Jones wanted extensive build-outs, custom studio modifications, creative autonomy, operational control. But the financial responsibilities tied to those demands, Sam claimed, were never fully met. The situation went beyond late payments. Sam alleged that he held a contractual stake in the podcast's media output, a percentage of the content produced within that space. That stake came with expectations of transparency and revenue sharing. Those expectations, he said, were ignored. Month after month, tension grew, bills piled up, trust eroded, and patience ran out. So Sam did something unexpected. He opened the door to a third party. And that third party was 50 Cent. Midpoint question. At this stage, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this still a feud, or has it become a business maneuver? Part 4. The audio that changed everything. What followed wasn't a rumor. It was a recording. 50 Cent documented a phone call with the landlord, and then released it publicly. In the audio, Sam laid everything out. Months of unpaid obligations. Alleged lease violations. Financial figures that stunned listeners. Estimates ranged wildly. Some said $80,000. Others said $180,000. A few reports pushed the number past $250,000. The exact figure became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the implication. The podcast operation, publicly critiquing ethics and exploitation, was allegedly operating in a space it couldn't afford to sustain. Electricity bills unpaid. Locks changed. Access restricted. 50 didn't sit on the audio. He posted it. He captioned it. He mocked it. The message was brutal in its simplicity. While you questioned my integrity, you couldn't keep the lights on. And that's when the conflict moved from commentary to control. Part 5. From commentator to controller. Shortly after the audio surfaced, reports began circulating that 50 Cent had partnered with, or possibly acquired, the building itself. Whether it was full ownership or partial stake didn't even matter anymore. Perception became reality. 50 posted online claiming partnership status and asserting control over the property. He warned publicly that any damage to doors or forced entry would result in consequences. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted completely. This was no longer artist versus artist. It was landlord versus tenant. And the next move wouldn't be lyrical. It would be documented. Part 6. The footage. On February 19, 2026, 50 Cent posted security footage that stunned even longtime followers. The video was quiet. No music. No edits. No narration. It showed Jim Jones and others standing outside the podcast studio hallway. The lights were off. The doors were locked. The power had been cut. Jones attempted entry. He commented on the electricity being shut down. Then, on camera, he kicked in a door. Every second was captured by high-definition security cameras. Cameras that 50 Cent now appeared to have access to. The footage wasn't dramatized. It didn't need to be. 50's caption tied everything together with surgical precision, referencing the podcast name and suggesting that none of this would have happened if we were friends. Alongside the footage, eviction notices were posted. The documents told a clear story. A 15-day default notice, followed by a 5-day termination notice. Both had already expired. Legally, the lease was over. Jim Jones was no longer a tenant, only permitted to retrieve personal belongings, under supervision. Nothing more. Part 7. Public reaction. The response was instant. Media outlets called it unprecedented. Fans described it as ruthless, strategic, and cold. Others praised the restraint. No violence, no threats, no chaos. Just contracts, cameras, and timing. Some questioned the ethics of releasing surveillance footage. Others questioned why the situation had been allowed to deteriorate in the first place. But one thing was clear. This wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. YouTube commentary channels dissected the situation as a collision of ego, business, and modern power dynamics. One comment summed it up best. This wasn't a diss. This was a case study. Final reflection. What this really means. So what does this story actually tell us? It tells us that in today's entertainment industry, power doesn't always shout, it documents. Influence doesn't always argue, it waits. And reputation isn't defended only with words. Sometimes, it's defended with ownership. Jim Jones spoke about ethics. 50 Cent responded with leverage. Was it excessive? Was it justified? Or was it simply the inevitable outcome of challenging someone who operates beyond the microphone? That question doesn't have a clean answer. And maybe that's the point. The clips arrived like a cold front. Short, sharp, and impossible to ignore. A phone buzzed, a timeline scrolled, a cropped video looped, then another, each one a small, edited dossier of discomfort. Doors. Timestamps. A hand on a doorknob that refused to move. A camera angle that lingered on someone standing in a threadbare hoodie as breath misted in a cold room. Captions stacked on top of the footage like legal briefs, the language precise and performative. Pay by Monday or escalation begins. On paper, it would have been an ordinary property dispute. A landlord, a tenant, a lease gone sideways. But there is no ordinary when public figures are involved. Context tints everything. Names carry reputations. And reputations are currencies that trade in perception. So the footage did more than show a building's access denied. It converted a landlord-tenant conflict into a cultural event, a ritual of exposure that was equal parts spectacle and accounting. At the center of that spectacle stood a man who had always understood the power of optics. A showman who transformed personal vendettas into cultural currency, and then leveraged that currency into businesses that earned him the insulation to keep challenging. He posted with surgical timing, each upload a pulse that kept attention alive rather than letting it fade. For an audience trained, by social media and the mixtape era alike, to measure value in virality, the move was textbook. And across the feed was Jim Jones, a figure whose public persona had been built on survival and swagger, someone who had weathered the storms of shifting alliances and the collapse of collectives. The footage cut into his myth the way bright light strips color from an old photograph. It exposed seams and left viewers asking for receipts. How did this happen? Who decided this would play out as humiliation rather than a private invoice? And once the humiliation is public, what are the options left to a man whose career has been as much about posture as it has been about music? What followed was no textbook response. Jones did not run an angry live stream or launch a torrent of counter-accusations. Instead, he posted videos of himself cutting wood, practicing slow martial arts movements, and recording a short clip with Bruce Lee wallpaper visible in the background. He showed workers still in the space, tools lying around, a figure moving through an unfinished room like a director on a small, stubborn set. The caption was almost zen. Small gestures, no grand rhetoric, as if suggesting that the story the other side wanted to craft could be ignored by simply refusing the bait. Was this resignation? Or was it strategy? The answer depends on one question. Who benefits from the spectacle? The person who creates it, obviously. But also the audience, who consumes it in fragments, pauses it, clips it, adds a caption, and moves on. In this attention economy, wounds are monetized and indignations are commodities. The footage turned private negotiation into public entertainment. The battle, now spliced into short-form videos, sold out for clicks. To understand how we reached this point, you have to watch the archive. Rewind the story nearly 20 years and you'll find two collectives orbiting each other across a city's chessboard. One defined by abrasive, polished aggression and the other by baroque bravado and theatrical bravura. Good and bad blood braided through mixtapes, radio call-ins, and staged club appearances. Alliances shifted. Friendships cooled. The patchwork of loyalties that had once defined an era of East Coast hip-hop snapped in places where pride and profit pulled against each other. In 2007, there was a move that looked defensive on the surface but functioned as an offensive wedge. An invitation was extended to a pair of artists, an ostensibly friendly cross-pollination that, in retrospect, was a calculated pressure point. For one side it felt like a betrayal. For the other, an opportunity. Words once meant as banter hardened into barbed currency. "We like Jimmy better anyway," a phrase delivered with a smirk, wasn't praise. It was a well-placed lever. It implied that hunger could be shaped into leverage, that perceived loyalty cracks could be widened into rifts that had commercial consequences. That playbook, provoke, expose, benefit, has a long pedigree. The man orchestrating the recent footage had learned early to weaponize narrative. He survived real-world violence and turned that survival into a public myth, then used that myth to launch records, television projects, and businesses that made him less vulnerable to reputational attacks. When you have the capital to construct the narrative and the networks to amplify it, humiliation becomes not merely a weapon but a demonstration of structural advantage. So what does it mean to watch a fellow artist's dignity trimmed in public? Is it simply schadenfreude, the guilty pleasure of seeing someone whose image is polished suddenly scuffed? Or is it a more complicated cultural critique, a moment that makes everyone ask whether the persona someone sells matches the ledger behind it? The social media chorus, half mocking, half inquisitive, did not settle the matter. Comments ranged from jokes about winter breath to indictments about financial transparency. Some viewers focused on the physicality of the moment, the way a hand pressed against a door, the sound of a latch refusing to turn. Others zoomed out to the larger picture. Who owns creative spaces, who has the right to wield eviction as a performance, and whether this spectacle marks a new norm for how disputes are resolved in public. Jones's own response reframed the narrative. He turned attention toward the building as an incubator, showcasing unfinished rooms where young artists recorded, where equipment was being unboxed and set up, where keyboards lay half-assembled. If the other side's act suggested a deficit, disrepair, failure, neglect, Jones tried to translate it into forward motion. The cold rooms were not the product of neglect but the raw material of creation. The humiliation was being repurposed into a tale of persistence. But there were other signals too, reports of funds moving, of last-minute transfers to satisfy landlords, of calls placed and favors pulled. The dispute had a ledger not only in the public feed but also in bank records and text messages. The spectacle functioned as pressure, yet also as a bargaining chip. Once humiliation becomes a weapon, it can be traded. Are we watching a power play or a negotiation disguised as theater? Maybe both. Perhaps the truest insight is that in 21st century culture, power shows itself not merely in what a person can do, but in what they can make others witness. To trace the anatomy of these exchanges, you have to look at the mechanics. First, the provocation. Historically, provocation looks like a radio shot, a song, or a staged fight. Second, the amplification network. That's the social web of friends, foes, and platforms that will repost without context. Third, the payoff. Not necessarily monetary, but attention, which converts into opportunities and alliances. The latest chapter swapped bars for contracts and microphones for leases. It made paperwork visual, timestamps performative, and logistics dramatic. In a way, this is a natural evolution, an adaptation of old rules to new mediums. If mixtapes were once the broadcast architecture of street-level credibility, now public posts are the new ledger. You can build a reputation in a studio, but you can dismantle one with a clip and a caption. The architecture of humiliation thus evolved. No longer only lyrical dismantling but documentary-like, time-stamped evidence that slices a myth in two. That said, the spectacle had other consequences. It reshaped perceptions of the community that had formed around the space. Was the studio a hub for mentorship and for young talent, or was it an expensive vanity project that never quite stabilized? The truth likely sat between those extremes. Buildings can be many things at once: a place for creation, a financial burden, a chance to signal status. And when a public figure is involved, those contradictions become public property. Which raises the question: who decides which parts of the truth get amplified? The person with the loudest speaker, or the one with the most credible footage? Or the platform's algorithm, which prefers loops and engagement over nuance? The answer is a messy combination. Algorithms don't know loyalty. They only understand dwell time. Human actors, knowing this, structure their content accordingly. The person who posted the footage timed it to guarantee eyeballs. The person on the receiving end attempted to minimize the emotional charge by offering a different script, one of work, of resilience, of community. There are human costs here. Careers are built on image. Tearing at that image can be career-altering. But there are also subtler casualties, relationships that fray when private disagreements are weaponized publicly, emerging artists who lose confidence in the systems they rely on, staff who find themselves cast as set pieces in a dispute they did not create. The spectacle's ripple effects are social as well as professional. It is tempting to moralize, to decide who is right and who is wrong. But the deeper, more uncomfortable question is structural. How does a community sustain itself when conflict becomes content? When the apparatus of capitalism refracts personal failures into entertainment, what recourse do the less powerful have? You can sue, you can publicize, you can pivot. But the machinery that profits from spectacle is indifferent to nuance. Consider a young producer who used the studio's console in the weeks before the footage dropped. A kid with a scholarship in one hand and an unpaid invoice in the other. For that person, the fight between two titans is less about narrative and more about continuity. The feed's loops could threaten their project, their momentum, their credibility. They didn't ask to be part of an auction for attention, but they are collateral all the same. So what should be done? Is the right call to press charges for defamation? To file for damages? To make donations? To launch a counter-narrative campaign? Each option has trade-offs. Legal avenues are slow and provide fodder for new clips. Counter-narratives require resources and may escalate the spectacle. The real wisdom might be in focusing on the work, showing the finished albums, the mentorship sessions, the pay-it-forward programs, and letting product speak where controversy cannot. But product takes time. And attention moves faster than albums do. Which is why the choice to post those martial arts clips mattered so much. It was a tactic designed to puncture the escalation. Instead of responding with matching aggression, Jones used a different register. He offered a scene that was oddly domestic and deliberately disarming. A man chopping wood, a slow breathing exercise, a studio with wires hanging like tentative scaffolding. The gesture invited the viewer to look again, but to feel less invited to mock. It was a strategy of humanization. Does humanization work when the other side has already posted evidence meant to shame? There is no clean answer. But in moments of public spectacle, the ability to change the frame is invaluable. Reframing is how reputations are rebuilt. It is also how, sometimes, wounds are made into something else, a narrative of comeback rather than collapse. There was also a legal subtext not visible in the clip but present in the Whisper network. Contracts that specified access, insurance clauses, and payment schedules. The modern hip-hop ecosystem is less a bohemian realm of endless collaboration than it is a web of agreements, venture capital-esque expectations, and income streams that run through multiple verticals. Ownership matters. The right to occupy space is legally defined, and those definitions can be weaponized. Leasing disputes are, in a perverse way, modern battlegrounds for cultural capital. Is that cynical? Or simply realistic? It depends on whether you believe that art and commerce can coexist without one overwhelming the other. For many artists, especially those who rose in the mixtape era, the dissolution between the two was already inevitable. You don't simply make a living off streams anymore. You need deals, brand partnerships, real estate, and diverse revenue. Studios are investments. They are statements. They are risk. And risk, when not fully underwritten, can look like failure. Which is precisely why the footage was so potent. It distilled perceived failure into a short visual story that the average viewer could digest in seconds. It cut through the complex scaffolding of debt, investment, and community with an image of someone denied entry to their own workplace. The simplicity of the scene, door, hand, breath, made it endlessly shareable. This, in turn, fuels a larger cultural conversation. Hip-hop has always been a mirror to social realities. Economic pressure, the hunger for respect, survival through hustle. The eviction footage is, in part, an update to that tradition. It exposes how, in an era of platform capitalism, disputes are resolved, not only in courtrooms but in feeds. It suggests that reputation management is now a performance art as much as it is a business skill. Yet we also saw resilience. The studio's online walkthroughs became a counter-archive. The unfinished rooms, the young creators at work, the candid moments of laughter. These clips didn't erase the humiliation, but they made the viewer pause and consider the fuller context. They invited a narrative of process, the messy, unfinished labor that precedes success. Is attention always bad? Not necessarily. Attention is fungible. It can be converted into exposure, fundraising, and new alliances. If the attention draws unexpected collaborators or spurs community fundraising, the spectacle can, paradoxically, seed recovery. But relying on spectacle for salvation is unstable. The better path is sustained work, product that extends beyond the timeline, and a set of relationships not contingent on daily virality. Another question that emerges from this conflict is about ethics. Is it ethical to weaponize humiliation for leverage? The popular answer among many observers was simple. If you can, do. But the philosophical answer has darker implications. Instrumentalizing embarrassment reinforces an economy in which people become content, easily consumed and discarded. It normalizes a kind of public cruelty that, over time, corrodes trust. If every dispute becomes a feedable moment, will artists and entrepreneurs retreat from public life or, worse, stop investing in community spaces at all? At the same time, it's important to avoid moral absolutism. This was not a clear-cut case of villain and victim. Power was being exercised by both sides in different ways. One used the platform to puncture a myth. The other attempted to reclaim dignity through process and human detail. The truth sits in the messy middle, the space where business, personality, history, and technology intersect. Near the end of the arc, what changed? There were transfers, there were statements recontextualizing the space, and there were more clips, some raw, some performative. Friends and former collaborators offered support in public and private. Old grudges were dredged up. For some viewers, the episode reinforced long-standing beliefs about what it takes to survive in the industry. For others, it created new awareness about the fragility of creative spaces. And for the people inside the building, the engineers, the interns, the producers, the outcome was less metaphor and more reality. Projects delayed, sessions rescheduled, and the emotional cost of being made visible without consent. These human consequences are the side effects often glossed over when a story is measured in likes. So what does this all mean for the culture of hip-hop and, more broadly, for public life in the social media era? Perhaps the key takeaway is unease. Unease about the system that rewards spectacle, about how quickly private disputes can become public, about how the tools of exposure can be used to settle scores. But within that unease is also a lesson about adaptation. Artists and entrepreneurs must now be literate not only in their craft but in optics, legalities, and platform dynamics. The ecosystem demands new skills: PR, legal counsel, and rapid narrative strategy. The old paradigm, mic, beats, raw hustle, is insufficient on its own. In the final calculus, the spectacle will keep writing itself as long as people watch. That may be the bleakest observation. Attention translates into power, and power is reinforced by continued attention. But the same dynamic offers an opening. If attention is currency, then intentional redirection, through product, community, and sustained narratives, can alter its flow. So where does that leave the individuals at the core of this story? They keep doing the practical work they can control. Men chop wood. Engineers tune consoles. Artists record. Money moves in small, private increments. Public posts continue to pummel the timeline, but the studio keeps trying to be more than a clip. The truth is often quieter than the feed. It is slower, more present, and only occasionally spectacular. And the audience? We keep watching. We clip. We comment. We decide in real time who to sympathize with and who to ridicule. We fold personal judgments into the larger architecture of culture, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. The moment asks the audience a question they can answer only with their attention. Will you be a witness that consumes, or a participant that supports? The case is unresolved, the wounds are still tender, and the feed keeps refreshing. In the end, perhaps the more difficult question is not about rent or reputation, but about the ethics of looking. What are we complicit in when we choose to watch?